Hello. Welcome to the Wholeness Wisdom Podcast. My name is Erin, and I am a holistic practitioner in the methods of wholeness and core transformation, which are experiential work through the body to integrate the sense of separateness, resulting in a lasting peace and ease. So here we are in this podcast to discuss ways that science, technology, philosophy, and also ancient wisdom traditions can give us guidelines for how to continue to integrate this sense of separateness in our daily living experience. And there are lots of examples of overlap of these concepts of separateness and integrated unity in these fields. So the topic today for this episode is decision making. And we all have the experience, or most likely do, of decisions being challenging. They can really lead to a sense of confusion, a lack of clarity, stress in the body, very active mind, sometimes insomnia, or just not being able to really be here, being in that decision mentally. There is a diagnostic term for the result of decisions being stressful for people, and that is called decision fatigue syndrome. The medical term is ego depletion, which is funny because here we're talking about dissolving the ego ultimately. So in the medical realm, it is ego depletion or decision fatigue. And they have ways of measuring fatigue on a human body. And there is a scale called the decision fatigue scale that is used in medical studies to measure decision on a person, the stress of decisions on people. And the way that participants can use this scale or measure their experience on the scale is that this relies upon their subjective experience of fatigue, weariness, or depletion. In one study that was measuring decision fatigue, participants were asked to lift weights until failure. They couldn't lift anymore. And they measured how long it took for the participants to reach failure. And then they had the group separate into two halves, and one half of the group went to scroll on social media for 30 minutes, and the other half of the group went to watch a NASA documentary on spaceflight for 30 minutes. And once that 30 minutes was up, the participants again went to go lift some weights, and they measured how long until the participants reached their limit until failure. And it turned out that the people who were scrolling on social media reached the failure point sooner than the people who went to watch this informational movie about spaceflight. And the reason is because in scrolling, there are so many micro decisions being made about, what to comment, what to look at, what to block, what to engage with, what not to engage with, what to scroll past. That decision fatigue happens pretty quickly in a social media kind of setting. And even furthermore, decision fatigue can happen for anybody, for whatever circumstance they're in, because we are making these little micro decisions throughout every moment of the day. And it can even lead to a physically weak result. It was measured. So I want to talk today about how decision making relates to the sense of separateness in our life and what we can do to have the whole process of decision making be a lot easier and a lot simpler for us, causing a lot less of that stress and fatigue. So here we go. So we can notice that whether feeling mentally drained or physically weak, we can easily understand why too many decisions or stress around decision making is a problem. When we don't know what to do, the mind tends to spin up the different outcome possibilities and churn around all of the possible details, micro decisions, possibilities, and really spin itself up. It can actually exponentially increase the decision fatigue because the decision of which thought to follow next regarding the decision becomes present, and it's just increasing, or it's spinning around itself in this sense of having to figure it out. So imagining, as a metaphor for this, we could imagine this industrial tank full of cream, and that we drop a ring into this tank. We don't know where it is. Imagine jumping into this tank and swimming around, waving our arms, trying to find this ring. It could be somewhere in the middle, it could be anywhere on the bottom, just moving all kinds of frantic activity, trying to find this ring. And as we're moving this way, the cream begins to turn to butter, and it gets thicker, not quite solid, but definitely hard to move around. And we get weaker and weaker and more tired, and we're not any closer to actually finding the ring. Conversely, imagine pulling the drain of this tank or transferring this cream to an adjacent tank and just noticing with our eyes where the ring is. So because that cream is so thick, because it had been opaque, can't see through it, moving blindly through it isn't really helping. It's actually making the situation a lot worse for us and using a lot more energy. And we could compare this to the experience of winding around our own thoughts and letting the mind become the one who needs to make this decision. If I only had enough information, if I could only imagine the scenarios correctly enough, then I could make this decision correctly. So putting this into a context of self-investigation and how self-investigation can help with the process of decision-making and fatigue, we can consider what a decision-making process is. We just slow it down, we stretch it out, we add some space to it, and notice there are 4 steps of this process. One is the problem or the situation, and the situation which is going to change. And then there is the options of how this situation will change. Then there's looking at the options before us and considering the options. And finally, there is making the decision. So 4 steps: problem, scenario, options, consideration, decision. As we slow this down, we take a look at where the actual stress is generated here. If we look at the first 2, problem, scenario, and options, they're pretty neutral. There's not a lot of emotional energy invested in this. It is factual. It is an exploratory part of this process, is just seeing the facts, situation, options. The consideration phase is where we really can get spun around our own axle, thinking about essentially ourselves in the outcome somehow. And furthermore, in order to be ourselves imagined in the outcome, we're also imagining ourselves in the scenario, in the options. So in the consideration phase is where the imagining, is where the spinning around, the churning is happening. And in that step, we are imagining ourselves. Okay. And then there's the final part, the decision-making itself. And that, again, is also factual. It is a decision. It is, the root of this word, Latin, is decidere, which is to cut off, which is to cut off all other options. And so again, that's pretty neutral. It's to just cut off other options and the decision is made. So as we stretch out the steps of that process, we can see that it is really only the third part, the consideration phase, that leads to stress and anxiety. Remember how decision fatigue is measured with the DFS, the decision fatigue scale, which measures the subjective experience of how mentally drained the participants felt. Our subjective experience is the indicator of pain within decision making. And the key here to having some relief from this pain is understanding how we relate to our subjective experience, how we relate to our subjective experience. A Course in Miracles is a 365-page book of lessons to investigate how we relate to our experience of life and the universe. It is a very interesting read, and it can be a great reference book. I don't follow the lessons myself, but I have picked through and noticed there's a lot of wisdom there. So if you're not familiar with it, I recommend taking a peek. One of the lessons I think really applies here today is from the beginning of the book, and something like lesson 4, something like that. But the lesson itself says, and it's like a mantra to ask oneself, these thoughts do not mean anything. They are like the things I see in this room, on this street, from this window, in this place. Again, the lesson is, these thoughts do not mean anything. They are like the things I see in this room, on this street, in this place. The point of this lesson in A Course in Miracles is to identify thoughts as what they are, mental objects, which we've talked about in episode 3. So if you would like to know more about what I mean by that, just take a look, and the link is posted on this caption. So to see thoughts as what they are, objects, meaningless, because a thought doesn't have any substance. It is even less than made of air. It is just a concept that comes through and moves on. Okay, it's meaningless in a sense that it's not tangible. There's nothing in it that we can open up and say, there's some real meaning in that. So the lesson is, these thoughts are meaningless, or these thoughts are objects. Okay, they're not the whole picture. So as we talk about decision making, I want to find out what happens in this consideration phase of decision making. And I'm going to cut right to the chase here for you. And it is that in all the thoughts that are happening around making a decision, considering, we are seeing ourselves, we are picturing ourselves, we are imagining ourselves as an object in those scenarios. We are objectifying ourselves as a thing in the thoughts that will be affected by the outcome. In the process of consideration, of making a decision, you think you are an object. And the pain of the decision making is coming from the thought that I am an object. Furthermore, being an object means that our well-being, our happiness, or our peace depends upon the decision. And that is what's happening in the consideration phase, right? We're imagining the options extrapolated into the outcome, and within that outcome, we're there at the end as an object, happy or unhappy. So this is not your fault. It is not my fault. This is a product of the conditioning. The prevailing worldview in our day and age right now is a materialist or reductionist view of reality, which hasn't been the case forever. It's actually only been the case for about 300 years, which is a tiny little blink of an eye in the whole history of human evolution. If we actually were to compress the whole history of human evolution into the scale of a single year, the last 300 years of materialist, reductionist worldview would be equivalent to 1 hour. The last hour of the whole year representing 2.5 million years of evolution. And can we really put all of our surety or all of our faith really in an idea, a concept, a position of perspective of reality, the cosmos, the world, everything, humans, how they relate to it, their experience in reality, in the span of the last hour out of 250 million years of evolution? I don't know that that could be so correct. And furthermore, talking about self-investigation, which is not a materialist worldview pursuit. Materialist worldview is really about acquiring things because we are things, and when we acquire things, we make this thing better or happier. Another perspective, which has been around a lot longer, is the unification theory of consciousness or the cosmos, reality. This present day term could be an analytic idealist perspective. There are other terms for it, but this is the most up to date in modern philosophy. But really, this perspective has been around for almost 3,000 years. And when we imagine how many civilizations have risen up and then crumbled and disappeared over the course of 3,000 years, there's a lot of stuff that's happened in those 3,000 years. And this perspective has stood the test of time, war, culture, disease, famine, plague. So maybe there's some lasting wisdom in that perspective. Maybe it's not perfect, but this is what I'm talking about here today, is shifting our perspective from a purely materialist perspective of ourselves as an object to ourselves as part of this unified whole, and also the implications that come from that shift, specifically today on decision making. So the example of the materialist worldview in today's topic, decision making, is that we take for granted in the thought process of considering a decision that we are an object in the decision. We are an object in the possibilities. And simply by imagining ourselves as an object in those scenarios and after being happy or not being happy, that's what that worldview looks like. So what does it look like if we're not imagining ourselves as an object in that process? So while we talk about this prevailing worldview that's only been around for 300 years, the problem here is that if I'm considering myself to be an object upon which my happiness depends on the decision or the outcome, what's happening there really is ignoring my subjective experience. It is going into the realm of purely intellectual rumination, which to ruminate comes from the word ruminant, which is a thick-toed animal that regurgitates its food and chews over it. So to ruminate is chewing on old stuff. to come up into the sphere and be ruminating about a decision, all of the experiential realm of being myself is thrown out the window. It is coming up into a concept of myself, and it actually removes me from my own life. And this happens so often throughout the day when we're conditioned into this worldview. We take it for granted that we are an object, and it happens across perhaps every single decision that happens in your day. Even those hundreds of micro decisions of scrolling through a phone. And all of this adds up to a lot of stress and tension in the body. Because really, considering this, if our happiness depends on the outcome, the happiness depends on myself as an object getting what I need to be happy, isn't it a hopeless position that we're putting ourselves in? We're putting ourselves in a position to essentially have to predict the future and predict the future correctly, a very specific way in order to get exactly what we need to be happy. And that's both putting ourselves in a position of godlike, omnipotent, omniscient power, and at the same time, a hopeless victim, because don't we all pretty much understand that the brain cannot predict the future accurately, ever? So we're putting ourselves in a position of responsibility that is so high, the bar is so high, we cannot be expected to meet it. So there's constantly this kind of hamster wheel trying to catch up to ourselves, and we can never really get there. It leads to a lot of internal suffering. And one more example of this shift in perspective from a materialist worldview to considering the other option of a unified whole is that we can think about a single cell in the human body and how the single cell is part of this vast whole network. It's like a web of life happening here. And the single cell has its routine. It's managing the cell wall, it's respirating, it's communicating through repair and damages and how to take care of what's going on. So that cell has its own routine, so to speak, like a maintenance routine. And it's not aware of my own personal maintenance routine of, showering or brushing my teeth or putting gas into the car. That single cell is completely unaware of the vast system that it is not only a part of, but it is not just of the body, but it is the body, the cell. So there's a modern day analytic idealist today. He has 2 PhDs. His name is Bernardo Kastrup, and he talks about this single cell metaphor on a cosmic scale, so that each individual, we're like that single cell. We can only participate in what we can tell is needed here. We're doing our maintenance routine here, completely unaware of the interconnected nature of this whole body of the universe that we are a part of. And he compares this to effectively dissociation, with the psychological, medical term for this, dissociative identity disorder. So he says that it's like the mind of nature is dissociating itself into all of these different personalities, which cannot tell the magnitude of which they are a part. And at the same time, they are not just of the universe, but they are the universe. Just like that single cell. It is not just of the body, it is the body. So while along the whole premise of this, if this cell of myself was really an object that was completely isolated from the whole, it was completely separate from the whole, then in this context of making a decision, then the whole idea of being vulnerable to the wrong decision causes a lot of anxiety. And again, the process of decision making is largely emotionless, except for this consideration part. That's where we become vulnerable, when we're thinking of ourselves as that isolated cell. The idea that we are responsible for creating situations that will bring about our own happiness or peace is a materialist notion. It's just an idea, it is just a belief, it is a dogma. When we relieve ourselves of the burden of this dogma, it is possible to participate in decision-making without taking ourselves so seriously and without considering ourselves to be isolated and lacking in some way. and needing of a certain situation in order to be complete. The investigation is really potent. And because decision making is so familiar to all of us, it's an easy place to start, to just find out, am I considering myself an object here? When thinking is happening, am I in that scenario of thought as an object that depends upon the outcome to be happy? Or am I something else altogether? Am I not really a thought? Am I not really isolated? Am I actually part of a vast network, like a web? So the computer, having the internet coming through it right now, the computer is not producing the internet. The computer is a vehicle through which the web of the internet can come through and I can touch, I can connect to. So what if this body, including its thoughts, is not the internet, it is not the web, but it is a vehicle through which this consciousness, which is the mind of nature, the mind of God, the mind of reality, is coming through and talking to you now. And when we are in touch with ourselves that way, something greater than just matter, hard, isolated particles of matter, when we are considering ourselves as something greater, we can be in touch with this inner knowing that comes more from the heart or from the movement of what is really wanted and needed. It is not a mental process. It is a process of listening, being with the first two phases of decision making, the situation and the options, and taking in the facts, resting in the facts, and listening to what this system responds. It is less about considering the options and staying in the rumination, and is more staying with ourselves as part of this network so that we don't need to be the computer making the internet happen, but we can be the internet open to the Wi-Fi signal coming in. And this can sound pretty intangible because it is, because materialist culture tells us that it needs to be measurable. It needs to be a particle that we can see through some sort of instrument and we can say, aha, that's it. That's the answer. But really, have you ever been able to see your consciousness? Have you ever been able to measure your awareness? No. And can you say that your awareness is not real? No. So this is part of the investigation. And again, as I said, it's pretty clear when we're having anxious thoughts. It's pretty clear when we're stressed. It's pretty clear when we're ruminating about a decision. And instead of continuing to ruminate, we can see the ruminating is happening. And we can see that as a habit. And we have the option to slow it down and just observe it as another fact. Consideration doesn't have to be super emotionally charged. It can just be another fact. And we can slow it down enough to say, can I see what I'm not here? Can I see what I am not right now? And for me, this looks like having this decision to make, going through all these thoughts and ideas and seeing myself in this imaginary scene. And when I stop and go, can I see what I'm not? I can see this imaginary Erin in this scenario, and I can go, yeah, that's what I'm not. That is a thought. That is Erin as an object in a thought. That's what I'm not. And it doesn't have to be this whole complicated formula of what to do in order to get better at making decisions. It is really seeing what I'm not is part of the process of allowing ourselves to be what we are, which we don't need to do anything in order to be what we are. We are already aware. We are already conscious. And we are already connected to this vast, cool web of nature. We're already connected. So all we have to do is see what we are not. And that is how to break the habit of taking ourselves to be an object in the context of making a decision. Because we make so many decisions every day, it's a really good place to begin asking, can I see what I'm not? And the integration of this is definitely a worthwhile endeavor. It has been for me and some people that I've worked with, because generally the consideration phase today for me contains little to no anxiety. And I know that no matter the outcome, my happiness is not dependent on that outcome. My peace is not dependent on that outcome. This allows a happiness and a joy or a peace to be present throughout all the phases of making a decision, and whatever the outcome, that peace is unchanged. There may be a response like disappointment or embarrassment or any other emotion. That's also what I'm not. But that joy and peace, that is just an aspect of my nature, or that web of interconnectedness, that is not affected by the outcome. So there's a lot less contraction around decision making. So it's a worthy endeavor to explore this. I hope that this was a helpful episode for you. And for those of you who can see me, I know I look a little cozy today, a little less put together. And I just love to include that something I heard was really wise. It said, what I look like is the least interesting thing about me. And when we consider ourselves to be a vast network of interconnectivity, that is really true, because there is so much that's interesting about me. And so it's nice to be able to just show up as I am with this great message to share and discuss with you. So if you'd like to discuss any of this, please leave a message in the comments. I will respond. And also, you can check out, we have some free meetings that will be happening through Zoom to discuss topics like these, also discuss Bernardo Kastrup's work, who I mentioned earlier. You can find that on the website, which is wholenesswisdom.com and connectcreatewholeness.com. Thanks so much for visiting or listening here today, and I will be catching up with you next week. Thanks. Bye.